Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you for the third of our Parody and Religion series, Reverent Irreverence. We're honored to be joined by three junior scholars today doing some of the cutting-edge work on parody, humor, and religion. I'm excited to introduce them. The event tonight, as you all know, is called Pranksters, Standups, and Fitness Gurus, New Perspectives on Parody. And one thing that I love about this collection of people we're going to hear from today is that they suggest the breadth of the topic of parody, that parody is not a topic that allows itself to be confined to one area. You can make fun of anything, and I think we're going to see that in a lot of different great examples tonight. We'll be hearing first from Joshua Wright, who is an assistant professor of religion instruction at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, where he teaches courses in American religious history. He's earned his PhD from the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard in 2023 and is currently at work on a book titled Church Carnival, Laughing at and Laughing with Religion in Modern America. It is an intellectual and cultural history of the relationship between humor and American Christianity in the 20th century. And his talk tonight will be titled Jesus and Jest, Comedy and Christianity in the 1960s. After Josh's talk, we'll be hearing from Samah Choudhury, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Ithaca College, where she teaches courses on religion, race, pop culture, and Islam. She is working on her first book titled Funny Feeling. These titles are so good. American Muslim Humor and the Politics of Secularity, which examines how Muslims have articulated themselves through the medium of stand-up comedy in the US and the ways that Islam gains recognition or becomes obscured under the specter and demands of US multicultural secularism. She is a research fellow this year in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. Her talk will be entitled How Stand-Up Made Islam Secular. And finally, we'll be hearing after those talks from our own postdoc, Cody Musselman, who is currently at the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. We're delighted to have her, where she's teaching classes on religion and sport and religion and wellness, while working on her first book entitled Spiritual Exercises. The project observes how the structuring logics of American Christianity operate in the consumerist landscape of health, wellness, and fitness to understand how religion is enlisted in the politicizing work of reforming the body. The short version of that is it's about CrossFit and SoulCycle. Her research has appeared in American Religion, Religion Dispatches, and The Conversation, and Cody earned her PhD and master's degrees at Yale, an MTS in Religions of the Americas at Harvard, and prior to that, a BA at Kalamazoo College. Her talk will be entitled In on the Joke, Selling Parody and Religion at SoulCycle. And I should have said at the beginning, my name is Fannie Bialek. I'm a professor in the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening. So we will begin with Joshua Wright, and then after the three talks, we'll have Q&A, and I hope to hear from all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fannie, and thank you to Lee and Hannah and Deborah and everybody else at the Danforth Center. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So this talk is a piece of a larger project that I'm working on that offers an intellectual and cultural history of the way in which American Christians, on the one hand, but also kind of irreligious comedic skeptics, employed humor, comedy, satire to attempt to shape Americans' opinions about institutional religion, especially in the 20th century United States. Now, often these comedic techniques were used to offer criticisms of religious hypocrisy or perceived authoritarianism, but oftentimes, and especially on the Christian side of that story, humor was increasingly accepted as a means of making faith kind of authentic and relevant in an increasingly skeptical age. And so today I want to focus on two figures that represent both sides of that story. First, the Protestant and liberal Protestant theologian Harvey Cox, who is one of the leading kind of figures of the theological engagement with the subject of comedy in the 1960s. And then I'll turn to Paul Krasner, a leading figurehead of the post-religious counterculture, roughly at the same time. And I'm going to conclude the talk today by looking at an event in which these two men shared the same stage with some interesting results and, I think, implications for how to think about the history of religion and humor in the United States. Now, let me just say a word or two here at the top about the longer history of Christian engagements and attitudes toward humor, laughter, comedy, and jest. This has historically been a relationship of some ambivalence. Christians have rarely completely denounced laughter as inherently sinful, but the fact that Christ, for instance, in the Gospels, is mocked while being crucified has led to the kind of sensibility or the sentiment that transgression and even blasphemy is never all too far away when laughter is present in the realm of religion. That said, once you move into the 20th century, especially in the United States, American Christians, for a variety of reasons, are starting to rethink this attitude and starting to wonder whether Christianity has lost some of that comic element that might be fruitful. In the late 1950s, one of the leading liberal Protestant magazines, the Christian Century, even publishes an article kind of complaining that, in contrast to the long-standing view that Jesus never laughed, now the subject of Jesus' sense of humor was so common in American pulpits that it had become kind of overdone and annoying. And by the 1960s, there's a kind of wave of theological interest in the concepts of comedy and humor and laughter. And one of the leading figures here, again, is a Harvard Divinity School theologian named Harvey Cox. Cox was one of the most preeminent religious intellectuals in the 1960s. He had a keen sense of theological trends in the broader zeitgeist. He was an early activist in the civil rights movement, and in 1965, he gained broad notoriety for his best-selling book, The Secular City, which represented a kind of Christian welcoming of secularization as a process. Just a couple years after The Secular City, though, Cox turned to the theme of comedy, which eventually culminated in his 1969 book, which you can see presented here, The Feast of Fools. Now, Cox, his main concern and his great fear was that the mainline Protestant liberal churches had lost a sense of festivity and comic vitality that he thought was present in earlier ages of Christianity, most notably in the Middle Ages, with the Feast of Fools and the kind of the carnival as these liturgical but transgressive celebrations. And Cox's fear, primarily, was that American churches had become too formal, too stuffy, had lost a sense of spiritual authenticity and vibrance. All that remained, he said, were chilly gray sanctuaries that offered Americans little by way of kind of genuine religious and authentic experience. And so, he said, young Americans were turning to things like the New Left, or rock concerts to get this sense of festivity and vitality. Now, the solution, in Cox's view, was a playful comic form of Christianity that could at once provide authentic experiences of transcendence that satisfied secular minds at the same time, but also using satire and parody to call the powerful into account. The theologian asserted, quote, "Comic hope is the mood of our embryonic religious sensibility today. It provides the only possible idiom for faith at a time of dead gods, museum churches, and antiquarian theology." And to this end, Cox suggested that American Christians reclaim what he called the carnival spirit of earlier ages of Christianity. And in the process, Cox suggested reimagining Jesus as a sort of revolutionary jester or harlequin who lampooned the political and religious establishment. And you can start to see how Cox begins to apply this in one of the outlets in which he attempted to popularize this position, Playboy magazine, which might seem a somewhat odd venue for a theologian to be trying to make an impact, but Playboy at the time was recognized as a pretty significant and culturally influential kind of cultural forum. And so Cox, in 1970, publishes an article in Playboy kind of summarizing a lot of these ideas called For Christ's Sake. He presents Jesus as what he calls a joyous revolutionary. And the piece was accompanied by this illustration by the artist Fred Berger of a laughing, kind of jolly Christ, which at the time, it's worth noting, is a stark contrast to the dominant traditional image, visual image of Jesus in American culture in this mid-century era, the Warner Sallman's Head of Christ, which most of you are probably familiar with. Now, Cox, while he's theologizing and theorizing, he's also trying to put these ideas into practice. When he performs and delivers a series of lectures at Harvard, where he's first developing these ideas, he does so in a format which unfortunately I didn't bring with me today, but balloons and a light show and kind of comedic comedy clips that he used in the presentation, and it went over quite well. And Cox also was constantly reaching out to other members of this emerging ecumenical Christian left that similarly had this focus on playfulness, humor, parody as means of spiritual and political engagement. And two examples I'll just briefly reference are first the stand-up comedian and civil rights activist Dick Gregory, who regularly gave performances in churches and youth groups, oftentimes quite critical of the institutional church. And in the early 1970s, he published his own comedic biblical commentary, Dick Gregory's Bible Tales. You can see a copy of that on the screen. Now, from a progressive Catholic perspective, a similar figure is the pop artist Sister Corita Kent, who was known for playfully juxtaposing the images and symbols of American commercial culture with Catholic imagery, and also including social protest in the mix. She famously, in some of her collages, for instance, draws upon Wonder Bread as a brand to comment on issues of hunger and poverty, and also the body of Christ as present in the Eucharist. So by the late 1960s, there's this real kind of sense in which the Christian left is desiring to fuse both serious political engagement with playful religiosity. But now I want to turn to the other side of the story that looks at the kind of post-religious or the more irreligious side of the counterculture as represented by Paul Krasner. Now, Paul Krasner is probably best known as one of the co-founders of the Youth International Party, or the Yippie movement, alongside Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who did all sorts of very performative pranks and the like. But before he got his start as a Yippie, he was a major figure in the underground press and the comedic scene in the late 1950s. Krasner, who was by this point a convinced atheist, founded The Realist, a satirical free-thought magazine that used cartoons, comedic poems, and various satirical op-eds in order to irreverently take down institutional religion in all its forms, and especially the Catholic Church, which Krasner associated with reactionary politics, especially with respect to sexual issues like abortion, birth control, and the like. Now, Krasner also is notable for being a friend and a colleague and a booster for perhaps the most controversial stand-up comic of the 1960s, Lenny Bruce, who perhaps some of you are familiar with. Lenny Bruce kind of became extraordinarily infamous because of his comedic routines in which he challenged institutional religion and its representatives, from Billy Graham to the Pope, presenting them as kind of scheming advertising executives that were just out for a quick buck. And Krasner carried on these themes that Bruce is popularizing in The Realist. And here's an example. This is a relatively representative cartoon from The Realist pages, which is a presentation of American religion, especially Christianity, as a sort of perverse, grotesque amusement park scene. Krasner and the cartoonist are clearly drawing upon the recent opening of Disneyland to present Religion Land here, where you have a vendor selling crowns of thorns and communion wafers, a face in the hole crucifixion board, and the like. And this is one of the milder and gentler comedic attacks on American religion. When Krasner wanted to take aim at religious sexual repressiveness, he could be even edgier. In 1967, Krasner conscripted Margot St. James, a Bay Area sex work activist, to play a character that Krasner titled The Realist Nun. Now, this is a running gag that involved public stunts like Krasner and St. James, who was dressed in a full habit, making out and groping one another in public places, like in front of airports. And in The Realist, Krasner published photographs of St. James, again dressed in a full habit, reading to a group of nude novices. Now, such comedic material positioned Krasner in the masculinist wing of the sexual revolution. He was hired by Hugh Hefner to be a contributing editor for Playboy around this time. And feminist critics increasingly began to attack Krasner as representing basically the misogynistic element of this counterculture that was coming into being. The radical feminist journalist Robin Morgan lambasted Krasner in a famous article called "Goodbye to All That," and cited The Realist Nun as proof in point. But Krasner, along with figures like Lenny Bruce, is beginning to push the boundaries of kind of propriety in the mid-20th century US. Now, these two worlds and these two figures converged in 1967 at a hip Manhattan venue in Greenwich Village. Renewal magazine, a left-leaning Protestant magazine, was holding an event called An Evening with God. Now, the headline speakers included Cox, as well as Krasner, alongside Dick Gregory, the hip Episcopalian priest Malcolm Boyd, and the psychedelic guru Timothy Leary. The promoters billed this event as, quote, an experiment in worship that was trying to create links between the liberal wing of the churches and this emerging counterculture. And humor, especially irreverent humor, was a major element of the night's proceedings. The speakers generally displayed a belief that humorously transgressing conservative taboos paved the way for personal freedom and social justice. Dick Gregory performed much of his kind of material along these lines, and even Harvey Cox, the theologian, tried to embody his own growing commitment to a playful form of Christianity by jokingly comparing the erotic material in the Song of Songs to Playboy. But the most bombastic moment of the event, as you might expect, came from Paul Krasner, who called himself the token unbeliever on stage. His primary contribution was to recount for the audience a story from the prior evening. Krasner narrated listening with a girlfriend named Miranda to an evangelist who was railing on in hellfire and brimstone fashion about sexual immorality and similar themes. And then Krasner's partner, Miranda, said a line that Krasner went on to use for shocking effect in this event. And I'm just going to read out Krasner's account here with editing of an obscene term. But this comes from Krasner's autobiography. Miranda made the most religious statement that whole night. She said, "I'm so glad I have a C word." It was a celebration of life. At an evening with God, I told that story and invited the women in the audience, including several nuns, to repeat Miranda's chant after me as a congregational response. Now, this was exactly the sort of stunt that feminists were using as evidence of Krasner's misogyny and the misogyny of the masculinist wing of the counterculture. Krasner, for his part, saw this as just an argument against religious sexual repression, but his religious audience did not approve of this comedic stunt. The audience collectively refused to repeat the line, and Krasner was met with a combination of jeers and laughter in that jeering fashion and boos. He had managed to basically alienate all of the different religious corners of his audience, Protestant and Catholic. And a Princeton chaplain reporting on the event refused to recount the details, only wrote that the atheist provocateur had, quote, reached a new low in public vulgarity. Now, I think this incident helpfully reveals a few aspects about this particular moment in American religion and American culture. Now, obviously, it shows that there remain significant tensions between even the Christian left and the emerging counterculture, at least as represented by Krasner. Krasner clearly crossed a comedic and moral boundary that his audience found distasteful. But despite that, I think this also suggests that there was a shared sensibility among all of those representatives on stage, ranging from the atheist Krasner to the Christian Harvey Cox. And this was the conviction that it was necessary to fuse a playful and irreverent brand of humor with moral and political critique, including a critique of religious institutions. Now, in closing, let me just say a bit about some of the long-term effects of this quintessentially 60s moment and its interest in parody and play and festivity and the like. Krasner and the Realist have had a profound impact, along with Lenny Bruce, of course, on more or less the entire tradition of American stand-up comedy since then, but especially the strain represented by figures like George Carlin, who regularly use kind of irreligious comedic jokes in order to attack what they see as the repressive or superstitious elements of religion. And to a degree, even something like the cartoons that are showing up in The Realist create a culture of underground cartooning that eventually leads to things like South Park and Family Guy. Now, on the Christian side of things, Harvey Cox and his book Feast of Fools is a direct influence on, first, the movement that comes to be labeled sometimes in a derogatory fashion, clown ministry or clown masses, which at times in the 1970s and 1980s literally brought the humorous play of the circus into churches and carnivals. But beyond this, Cox's work influences the musical Godspell, which becomes a pretty significant hit in the 1970s, and which presents Jesus as a sort of hippie-like clown, right? You can see the resemblance there. But that said, with historical hindsight kind of available to us, this is in some ways a fad, a theological fad. There remains some interest in the theological uses of humor, but certainly this highly politicized and self-professed revolutionary or radical form of playful Christianity begins to go into decline relatively soon after its emergence. And to leave you all with an enticing hint that's probably unfair, in some sense, it's not liberal Protestants and liberal Catholics that are most able to effectively use humor and comedy to present their religious views, but in fact, over the following decades, it's conservative evangelicals that are able to build up this comedic kind of infrastructure to support their views. But with that, thank you all, and again, I look forward to the conversation.
Good afternoon, good evening. It is a pleasure to be with you all here in St. Louis. My name is Samah Choudhury. I'm an assistant professor at Ithaca College. We have convened here today under the very generous auspices of the Danforth Center to talk about religion and politics, but you know that already in relation to parody and laughter, which is this vocal, affective, joyous thing that when done right, fills up a space. My religious studies training is quick to note how much of a ritual laughter can be, and humor and jokes can be, where meaning is made through the act, right? It's our participation that is imbuing this thing with sacred significance. And in doing so, we are transforming both the space that we are in and the time that we are inhabiting into something such that it was not even just a moment ago. So laughter may ring throughout a room, but if you listen, the sounds of silence ring just as clear. And that silence speaks to a grim truth. What a privilege it is here to gather and talk about humor and comedy in this room, in this university, in this place, this land, this scarred land that was scarred to make way for the university, this room, and this privileged conversation we're having today. It is the scars of forced removal, of people and families from unceded territories, of deceitful treaties that ceded even more, of widespread disease and death and genocide of the Osage Nation, Otoe, Missouri, Illinois Confederacy, Quapaw, Ho-Chunk, Miami, and many others. And it is so easy to feel sad and to entertain remorse and resolve that we're going to do better for an event that we Americans have comfortably put in our rearview mirror. It is harder to do those things now, but it is exactly also why we must, because this is a reality that is shared by colonized people the world over. In Gaza, we have reached an unfathomable threshold of death, 30,000 people who will never again get to tell a joke or make snarky comments with their friends, make their sister laugh so hard she spits water out of her nose, since October 7th, when another 1,200 people were made to face the same fate. These are joys that war and fear and political ambition and ethno-nationalism rob from humanity. And if we are to take humor and parody seriously, then we are also going to have to take this seriously. The most meaningful moments of humor come from recognition, where we can identify ideas that we've deemed to be ordinary or necessary as actually being obtuse or incongruent with the ways that things should be. In this case, in all cases, that no matter who or where we are, people deserve justice and they deserve to be free. And yet so many obtuse and incongruent notions remain comfortably in place today. Notions about who fits the bill for entry into modern secular society and who cannot seem to extricate themselves from the so-called natural limitations of their religion, their culture, their blood. How such limits map onto particular bodies is a question that preoccupies my corner of the world, where the stand-up comedy stage arbitrates who makes the cut along similarly equalizing terms. In today's permutations of what is required of the comedian, the consensus seems to be that you just have to be funny. You have to take the joke as well as you can dish it, and that's all that matters. Now, I am fascinated by this conception of the Comedy Guild, one that positions itself as home to the clever anthropologist who is wielding a microphone, who is unbridled by parameters, free to comment on, even embody the incongruities that they've observed. Funny is supposedly an equalizer. It is the job's only obligation. And yet, to bring together something like comedy and something like Islam creates a curious incongruity. But dear audience, you already know why you think it's a curiosity. It's just that the association between Muslims and humor is a relationship that you may implicitly recognize, but maybe it's less a relationship between them and more a relationship between the lack of those two. That relationship, especially in the last 40-some years, is something that feels, indeed it's been made to feel, natural. Muslims are either stoic or they're mad, they're unfriendly, they're stubborn, they're quick to fly off the handle. When you offend them, they just can't take a joke. Now, recent global flashpoints further naturalized this notion. What gets dubbed the Salman Rushdie affair in the 1990s, the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005, the Charlie Hebdo shootings in 2015. The social debates then that follow have usually boiled down to two persistent questions. Why can't Muslims take a joke? Oh, is this not working? There. Why can't Muslims take a joke? Which is quickly usually followed up by, is Islam compatible with modernity? Well, there we go. There have been scholars who take up this charge. Some quickly turn to the earliest episodes of early Islamic history for proof of Muslim humor in the Quran, in Hadith, while others We'll look at examples of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions as lighthearted jokesters, whose levity was meant to be emulated by later generations of Muslims who have just deviated from the prophetic example. Still others like to point to a more contemporary emergence of Muslim comedians after September 11th, when laughter becomes a symbol of freedom and a value of American democracy. See, there seems to be a lag here. Okay. But how is it that humor has become such a de facto principle of modernity and an admirable personality trait of this modernized person? It is ubiquitously sought across college admissions, in dating pools, employee interviews. It's a critical relationship to understand because our discourses and our scholarship are doomed to continue returning to these same pernicious and tired premises where Islam is pitted against modernity, with no greater comprehension as to why this premise is so naturally presumed at the outset. It's also no wonder that someone like the American Muslim comedian Hasan Minhaj would find himself shunted so precipitously between the poles that he would stumble and fall. Now, you may recall just a few months back when an article published by The New Yorker about Minhaj unleashed a storm in Twitter's teacup. Staff writer Claire Malone had interviewed Minhaj about his creative process, and in it, he explained to her that building an impactful political narrative in comedy requires meeting a series of marks before a punchline can pay off in a way that is both funny and meaningful. But do we care? The staff writer, Claire Malone, posed that so many of the events that Minhaj's act builds up in this way didn't actually happen to him. For Minhaj, this was not a controversial revelation. It's just a part of the comedic conceit, he explains. Quote, "For every story in my style is built around a seed of truth. My comedy, Arnold Palmer, is 70% emotional truth. This happened. And then 30% hyperbole, exaggeration, fiction," unquote. For him, the punchline, he says, is worth the fictionalized premise. Now, Minhaj's indictment, you may recall, was swift. The internet agreed that his actions were manipulative and deceitful. Paramount Global was all but ready to announce Minhaj as the new host of the comedy flagship show The Daily Show, whispered industry insiders. And yet, after Malone's article, executives quietly went back to the drawing board. Now, time makes fools of us all, sure, right? But Minhaj has a standing contract with Netflix. He has a shelf full of Emmys, a seat on the Time 100 list, and Jennifer Aniston's phone number. He has been described in the same breath as social commentary comic legends like Lenny Bruce, like George Carlin, Fannie Bryce, Dick Gregory, and Red Fox. The New Yorker, in more hospitable days, contended that Minhaj offers a charismatic face for the word Muslim, which counters xenophobia in America. From sold-out shows in September to then filming a crisis management reel that is pleading, "I'm not a psycho," in October, the gulf is glaring. What happened? Minhaj and other American Muslim comedians like him emerge from a very culturally distinct milieu over the last decade, one that traffics very heavily in visuality, the seen and the unseen, where what we see functions as an authorizing document. And you've heard this, right? I'll believe it when I see it. I know what I saw, that the image is what enacts the quote-unquote real. And we in the academy, especially those of us that take seriously spectatorship, we recognize the power of that, right? The power to look, the power to be looked upon, to register our gaze as being oppositional. Our popular culture even has a name for it over these last several years. We call it representation. In fact, representation matters so much that now representation matters TM, all rights reserved, right? It's no longer a rallying cry, but it's actually a fully fledged and fleshed institution, complete with programs and trainings and representatives to carry out said representation. In the midst of this windfall, throughout the US and television film industries, the most prominent Muslim storytellers to ascend have all been male comedians. Minhaj, yes, but also others like Aziz Ansari, Kumail Nanjiani. All of them have inked production deals with media powerhouses like Netflix, Disney, Apple, etc. But there are no coincidences. Here, we actually have the droids you've been looking for, the Muslim who can not only take a joke, but make it. A sense of humor, which is so elusive and likely non-existent among the Muslims who otherwise paper our visions, is expressed in embodied and choreographed performance here. The comedy stage shines a literal spotlight on the comedian's body. It trains the audience's focus and then asks this audience to respond with what would ideally be non-derisive laughter. Because even before the comedian speaks, his body already has. In Minhaj's case, it is raced as South Asian or some kind of brown, an allusion to difference that is unspecific enough that it has to prove its legibility. At the same time, that legibility is always tussling with the Muslimness that is still read from and being endowed upon him. Jasbir Puar refers to this as the, quote, queer perversity of terrorist bodies, which is circulating through an economy built on affect. And it is, after all, the presence of material Muslim bodies which induce apprehension within broader discourses of security and securitization, masculinity, and white supremacy in the United States. Much of the scholarship on the racialization of Muslims today comes out of the study of Islamophobia and its deployment. There have been renewed political urgencies that have extended to the academy in order to tackle both incidents of and the underlying causes behind Islamophobia. Cavalier proposals for a Muslim registry, you may remember that, the implementation of what gets openly called the Muslim ban, that also then gets upheld by the Supreme Court, all engendered thick political solidarity in activist circles, among those fighting on behalf of racial minority groups. The popular organizing hashtag #NoBanNoWall joined together these issues of the Muslim ban and Latinx migration at the southern border, while debates that surrounded the racial makeup of the 2017 Women's March Leadership Committee resulted in new co-chairs that centered Black, Latina, and Muslim activists. Even key figures of the Black radical tradition, like Angela Davis, draw parallels between the occupation in Palestine, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and the militarization of police in suppressing Black Lives Matter protests. I am calling this a progressive consensus of recognition that has formed around this notion of race and racial categories being the prevalent language through which to organize or to recognize difference, to recognize inequities, to recognize oppression within an otherwise secular political apparatus. It is the quote-unquote master category, as Omi and Wynant have said, that it marks race as a difference, but also as a dimension of difference without any power or flow. It's something that should be celebrated because it is ultimately also inoffensive to the greater institutional governance, capital, and function. Oh, sorry, that was from before. This, I mean to be kind of the way that Netflix would have a take on diversity. Islam has found a subjective legibility since being subsumed within this category, whereby at any given moment, the Muslim may be seen as Black or brown or South Asian, but now, thanks to this progressive consensus, they can also be seen as a racialized Muslim because of the rhetorical room that opens up in order to register your resistance to this hegemonic order that reads largely as white. The racialized Muslim, then, does not create social problems. In fact, she is just subject to them. This is a marginality that is shared with oppressed others, and it enables these Muslims to make limited political inquiries, though nothing beyond the nebulous appeals to what are already usually mainstream secular demands. That premise plays out frequently in American Muslim comedy sets, where the comedian's self-articulation presents his authentic truths and his sincere testimony to beloved American tenets like free speech and equality. He is simultaneously dispelling the notion that at least this Muslim, right, him, lives outside of the confines of a modern society. Let me show you what I mean. So in one of his early turns as a star, Minhaj is offered the keynote speech at the 2017 White House Correspondents' Dinner, which you may recall was famously unattended by the then new president. This is a yearly tradition in the name of championing the First Amendment. Minhaj's speech took literal potshots at Donald Trump, and I want you to have a listen here. We'll have it played.
Free speech is the foundation of an open and liberal democracy. From college campuses to the White House, only in America can a first-generation Indian American Muslim kid get on this stage and make fun of the president. The orange man behind the Muslim ban. And it's a sign to the rest of the world. It's this amazing tradition that shows the entire world that even the president is not beyond the reach of the First Amendment. But the president didn't show up because Donald Trump doesn't care about free speech. The man who tweets everything that enters his head refuses to acknowledge the amendment that allows him to do it. Think about it. It's almost, what is it, 11? It's 11 p.m. right now. In 4 hours, Donald Trump will be tweeting about how bad Nicki Minaj bombed at this dinner. And he'll be doing it completely sober.
Okay, so Minhaj is doing a lot of things here, right? He's drawing attention to the racialized dimension of difference that is read off of his body. Brown, Indian, Muslim, right? The complex confluence of what he actually is less important than what he reads as. And what he reads as is actually quite simple. He is a Muslim who cannot dodge that pesky association with Islam, right? Much like Obama, but that's another paper. The apprehension surrounding that terrifying Muslim terrorist does not dissipate. So for Minhaj to own and celebrate his Muslim identity, he sanctions it through this broader frame of championing the First Amendment and the US Constitution. And here we have, then, a modern secular subject. He is a sovereign and self-owning agent that, as Talal Asad would designate, for whom Islam simply lives atop his body without ever being in danger of being possessed by it. It is this Muslim who becomes the recipient of the opportunity to confront that other Muslim, the one that is bound to a book and behaviors of a man from 1400 years ago, a subject who cannot hold beliefs, but who is possessed by them. Now, comedians like Minhaj have not missed or demurred from this moment. In fact, I'm arguing that they've met it. They have what I call a range of secular motion that is unavailable to Muslim women and Black Muslim comics, moving out from simply offering representation to now becoming representative. These men are now the only feasible Muslim subject legible within these broader secular taxonomies. But what about Muslim women comedians? They occupy a far murkier terrain under this other, hegemonic secularity. And that emanates from the particular place that they inhabit at the center of anti-Muslim discourses. They are the oppressed victims, right? That's a conclusion that is drawn from the hyperfixation on the visibility of their bodies. And we know this, right? There are vociferous debates by Muslim men about proper women's dress, to secular obsessions with their liberation from the hijab. There remains a palpable demand for the consumption and control over Muslim women's bodies. how much of them should or can be seen. Now, on the comedy stage, this becomes an added precondition to the material Muslim women comedians write and what they can make light of. The comedian Zainab Johnson, she was a semi-finalist in the show Last Comic Standing, just released a special on Amazon Prime titled Hijabs Off, just a few months back in October. Now, this was billed by Amazon as showcasing a gifted and daring comedian. Johnson actually wastes no time in confronting the biggest tension that is associated with her identity, and I want us to take a look at that here now, too.
Now, any Muslims in the house? Assalamu alaikum. We ain't never seen that on a comedy special. It's gonna be people tuning into this like, wait, what happened? What? You said this was a comedy special? Because this seemed like an episode of 24. What? Okay, I'll keep watching, okay. I always like to ask that. I'm Muslim, I know I'm underdressed. I like to say that I'm proud, proud black Muslim. Yeah. But I do get harassed by the haram police. Yo, they be after me. I can't post a photo without them commenting like, oh, you're not Muslim? You don't even cover your hair. I'm like, well, this is a wig, so technically. If I ran for office right now, my campaign would be, the wig is the 2023 hijab. So next time you see a woman with a wig, just say, Assalamu alaikum. I'm not the best.
Okay, so another comedian, Tissa Hami, she actually wears a prop hijab in her sets that she throws off because she intones in, kind of the vocal stylings of a valley girl that I was feeling kind of slutty. Neither Johnson nor Hami seem to be able to distance themselves from the notion that clothes play an outsized role in Muslim women's subjectivity. Rather, I'm seeing that their performances reinscribe the importance and the centrality of this kind of sartorial position. The Muslim man, in this case, is never far from the conception of that Muslim woman, not just because of what she is not, but because he is the reason behind that first oppressive precondition of her being. So expressing a legible secular autonomy would require Muslim women to take a second step that is difficult. It's actually a quite difficult needle to thread, because they would need to disavow that Muslim man. The comedy stage falters under the weight of this intersectional nuance. The comedian Maysoon Zayed, for example, has told the story of an interview with the American journalist John Stossel, in which he insists to her that her comedy could only ever exist in a place like the United States, and that she would not be able to make these types of jokes, quote, in your country, quote, as a woman, because it just wouldn't be possible. So he asks her, where's the gratitude in your act? Her rebuttal, that she is actually invited to perform in the Middle East very often, even as often as she is in the United States, gets cut from the final version of the interview, and it never airs. Now, Tissa Hami even has a bit that addresses why it is that actually American Muslim men are the ones who seem to be dominating this comedy stage. And even then, the joke that she carves around it cannot venture far from the corporeal. So why don't we play that too?
I was talking to this one reporter recently, and he goes, now, why aren't there more female Muslim stand-up comics? And I was like, well, I didn't want the competition, so I stoned them. And he goes, right.
Anyway, so the oppression that Muslim men face is a much cleaner, legible form of discrimination under the racialized dictates of this progressive consensus, meaning that he can now stand for not just his own oppression, but also hers. It's exactly this that lands Minhaj in hot water in October. One of the more egregious examples from the New Yorker article involves a prominent narrative arc in his special titled The King's Jester, in which he discusses FBI surveillance under the auspices, of course, of an ostensibly secular American government of his local Sacramento mosque in the years after September 11th. Now, Minhaj relays that this was his junior year of high school, and a burly, tattooed white man named Eric publicly converts to Islam on Friday prayers, or at the Friday prayer at the mosque, and then proceeds to offer weight training sessions to the young men of the community. Minhaj and his friends eagerly take up the offer, mostly to mess with Eric, whom they have easily guessed is an informant. Sure enough, Eric casually asks if the boys are interested in jihad. The police get called by one of the boys, who is worried that Eric is actually a radical, and Minhaj gets his head slammed on the hood of a car. And I want you to watch the rest of the bit here. He was one in a Muslim community in Southern California, a few hundred miles south, and was actually later sued by that community in a case that went to the Supreme Court in 2021. Versions of that story did happen, just not to Minhaj. Broad and sweeping surveillance of Muslim communities across the US were made legal under the 2002 Patriot Act, a successor to the FBI programs that spied on MLK, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Power movement. Minhaj even names the case of a young man from the next town over, his name was Hamid Hayat, who was accused of being a part of a sleeper cell in 2005 and was made to give a false confession. After over 14 years in prison, he was exonerated in 2022. Now, the New Yorker's article's main point was to emphasize just how much people look up to Minhaj for social and political commentary and how badly he had bungled that trust. Even colleagues like Trevor Noah, she's arguing, were duped, Malone notes, drawing attention to some of the now kind of ill-aligned praise that that Trevor Noah had written for Minhaj's Time 100 blurb, which said, Minhaj's whip-smart commentary, charisma, and sincerity is a consistent reminder that Hassan is America and America is Hassan. Now, my point is not to reiterate Malone's. Rather, I just want to draw attention to kind of the inevitability in someone like Minhaj, how representative he became, how a secular schema that is eager to demonstrate how much representation matters to them and to its own self-definition would foist all of that upon a single merchant who is also enthusiastic to take up that mantle. Here lies the conceit that Minhaj and other Muslim men in comedy have come to embody, where masculinity is still reflexively equated with authority, and the particularities of gender and blackness are stifled and sacrificed for instead a kind of best form of representing Islam, a subjective racialized form in which, as Black feminist scholars have long observed in other permutations, and as the scholar of American Islam Kayla Wheeler now writes, all Americans are Christian, all Muslims are brown, but some of us are brave. Thanks so much.
All right, these are two wonderful acts to follow. Thank you, Fannie, so much for the introduction, and thank you to the center and to Lee Schmidt for organizing this event. I'm really excited to be here today. I'd like to begin by sharing a recent experience I had in a cycling class. I was packed into a crowd of stationary cyclists, and we were nearing the end of class when our energetic instructor blew out the candles that had been lighting the studio, leaving us in pitch black darkness. Adopting a more solemn and reverent tone, our instructor began to speak over the building chords of electronic dance music. She told us to put all of our hopes and dreams on the handlebar of our stationary bikes. She told us to pedal as fast as we could and to not lose our concentration because our collective efforts were opening up a powerful vortex that would communicate our hopes and dreams with the cosmic power of the universe. She instructed us to close our eyes, push through the lactic acid building up in our legs, and to feel an emotional release as we imagined an energetic channel beaming out of the Upper East Side studio in New York City. So this was no ordinary spin class. This was SoulCycle. So how many of you are familiar with SoulCycle? Just a raise of hands. Okay, a collection, a smattering of you. Great. SoulCycle is an indoor cycling fitness franchise with studios spread throughout North America. Founded in 2006, SoulCycle set itself apart during the boutique fitness boom of the early 2000s by offering a bizarre mashup of rave culture, fitness guru devotion, and new age spirituality. Enter any given SoulCycle studio, and you will find exercisers cycling on stationary bikes in dark candlelit rooms, moving rhythmically to driving pop beats, while an instructor motivates the class through aphoristic sermons. And so far, this might sound like any other spin studio you've encountered, minus the candles, perhaps. But if you stick around, you might observe how SoulCycle positions physical exertion as the gateway to spiritual arousal by structuring its 45-minute classes around an emotional and physical arc that builds to what SoulCycle calls the breakthrough moment, when exercisers break down in tears. These breakthrough moments, or moments of catharsis, usually happen near the end of class. After the sprint intervals, the bike dance choreography, and the motivational phrases have physically and emotionally exhausted the exercisers, making them susceptible to the instructor's daily reflections on spiritual or social matters. Charging $37 a session, SoulCycle studios have become efficient mills of self-care and self-improvement, where the urban elite can get in a workout and a spiritual awakening in less than an hour. So there's much we could say about the intricacies of SoulCycle's business model or its carefully crafted soulful moments, but today I'm interested in focusing on the cultural perception and reception of SoulCycle by examining the parodies of it. Since its inception, SoulCycle has attracted media attention for its spiritually inflected fitness offerings and for its celebrity clientele, like Oprah, Michelle Obama, Khloe Kardashian, and David Beckham. But SoulCycle really cemented its cultural relevancy when it began to attract ridicule from cultural critics and comedians like Tina Fey, Amy Schumer, Alana Glazer, Abby Jacobson, and Saturday Night Live cast members, who saw the pairing of luxury fitness with spirituality to be patently absurd. So it's the ridicule, critiques, and parodies, and SoulCycle's reactions to them that I'd like to spend some time thinking about with you all today. I'm interested in what these humorous moments might tell us about religion in the marketplace and how they might shed light on the role that parody plays in shaping contemporary religiosity. Scholars of religion and parody, like Terry Lindvall, suggest that as long as there has been religious activity, there has been religious satire. Religious parody entertains as it exposes the follies of the priestly class, and as it makes the normal strange by careening into the absurd, parody pushes towards reform. This impulse towards reform reveals parody's inherently subversive nature. There is a danger in exposing the status quo as preposterous, inane, and as something we should not take all that seriously. Yet the revolutionary possibilities contained within parody reveal, as Melissa Wilcox reminds us, that parody itself is serious work. What Wilcox has dubbed as serious parody is a kind of poking fun that feeds activist energies and strives to have significant political, social, and religious impact. The parodies of SoulCycle we will witness today are of a related yet ultimately different sort. They offer a critique of SoulCycle's mass-produced, elitist, market-driven salvation, but they ultimately become reabsorbed within the company's brand identity and spiritual offerings. In analyzing the parodies of SoulCycle that circulate on Netflix, YouTube, Comedy Central, and Saturday Night Live, I want to suggest that we catch a glimpse of a kind of religion tailor-made for the 21st century. The religion of SoulCycle is highly individual, syncretic, and based in vague concepts like energy, vibes, and cosmic power. It is market-based, rooted in transaction and fleeting moments of community feeling. But perhaps most importantly, the religion of SoulCycle is a parody of itself. As we will soon see, religion at SoulCycle is sincere when it wants to be, and a laughing exaggeration when it needs to be. As a result, critique of SoulCycle's religiosity never fully lands because its object of critique is always shifting, morphing, tacking back and forth between earnest expression and winking jest, revealing that SoulCycle is already in on the joke. So I'd like to start by looking at perhaps one of the most well-known parodies of SoulCycle from the Netflix series Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. The series follows the titular character, Kimmy, as she navigates adult life on her own for the first time in New York City after breaking free from a doomsday cult. In one episode, Kimmy follows her wealthy boss to a spirit cycle class, where she becomes hooked on the inspirational narcissism espoused by the instructor. As the episode continues, Kimmy is forced to confront the man who held her hostage for 15 years in a doomsday cult, and she uses spirit cycle to escape the stress of reliving her trauma. So let's watch a clip of that now.
Pedal, pedal, be like a drunk girl getting out of a cab and leave everything behind. Your bag, your keys. Yes, that ginger in the corner is going to have to call her landlord from a payphone. Scream, you drunk mess, scream. Turn your resistance all the way up to Gandhi. Oh, it's supposed to hurt. It's Gandhi. Follow your bliss. Treat breakfast today. Imagine yourself on a beautiful beach. On a bicycle.
I see a dolphin.
Yes, it's beautiful.
I see it too.
You're a liar. You see no dolphin. Tell me more of the dolphin, Ginger. There is only here. There is only now.
My mind is so blank. I don't even know how to talk in milk.
And so, we are done. And unclip, ladies.
All right, here we see Kimmy fully immersed within the world of spirit cycle. We observe how she craves approval from her charismatic instructor and how she ascends the ranks of the fitness class faithful while spinning her way to bliss. Yet, Kimmy's bliss is short-lived. By the end of the episode, the guru instructor is exposed as a fraud. And he initially appears as a beacon of self-actualization to Kimmy, but when the lights turn on, he is revealed to be an unattractive, unfit man with acne and irritable bowel syndrome, who shares banal words of wisdom while seated on a toilet behind a screen of cycling legs. Aghast, Kimmy has to confront the fact that she exchanged membership in one cult for another. The mocking jabs of this episode invite us to make several observations about the kind of religion SoulCycle offers. First, the charge of cult has been levied at SoulCycle in the past for its evangelistic brand ambassadors, its bevy of devout customers, and its attractive, charismatic instructors. But this episode draws upon SoulCycle's explicit promise to offer harried urban consumers an escape from the demands of modern life inside the quote-unquote sanctuary of its fitness studios. By comparing spirit cycle and indirectly SoulCycle to a doomsday cult, this episode advances the commonplace idea that cults insulate their members from reality, and we see that play out in how Kimmy successfully avoids confronting the memories of her abduction and abuse by becoming absorbed in her mind beach, an imaginative world built by a fitness instructor's inspirational expressions and sustained by endorphins. For Kimmy, spirit cycle, like SoulCycle, elevates the power of the individual to create a different, more pleasant and affirming reality. Yet, this reality quickly evaporates as soon as Kimmy exits the studio. Embedded in the humor of this episode is a critique of how the commercial cult of me substitutes solipsism for professional therapy. We see how Kimmy's efforts to escape the trauma of her former cult life, only to end up in a newer, shinier, and purportedly more secular cult, reveals the irony and futility of finding refuge in a for-profit business guided by the logic of transaction. The episode makes clear that spirit cycle heals in as much as it distracts. It teaches the audience that Kimmy's spirit cycle escape, and just like our SoulCycle escape, is in fact no escape at all, but rather a postponement of reckoning. We might observe from this episode also how closely the show's caricature of SoulCycle resembles, well, SoulCycle. Here, the parody so closely resembles the thing it is trying to satirize that we might ask ourselves if it is really parody at all, or if parody and the object of its critique collapse into each other such that neither can be distinguished from the other. Take, for example, the references to SoulCycle throughout the episode. The candlelight, the branded apparel, the obsessive devotion, the inspirational instructor, the cutthroat competition to cycle in the front row, and even the instruction to imagine a beach as you cycle. These are accurate depictions of a SoulCycle class, with only a few exaggerated details added for comedic effect, like the toilet-bound instructor. And what I think this demonstrates is that we exist in a time when the parody of our embodied spiritual and economic lives is no more absurd than the reality. From this observation, I want to suggest that scholars of religion and interested observers ought to be paying greater attention to parody as a mode, if not the mode, of religious expression in contemporary life. Put differently, my provocation is that to understand contemporary religion in our meta-modern moment, we need to begin by looking at parody. I'd like to pause and briefly spell out how we've arrived socially and philosophically at a meta-modern moment and what that entails and what exactly I mean by that. So to get to the meta-modern, I'm going to start with the modern. By way of a quick overview, modernity is a political project and a set of cultural norms and conditions. Arising in the wake of the Renaissance and ushering in the Age of Reason, modernity cares about order and empiricism. And as it relates to religion, the condition of modernity, as Gustavo Benavides reminds us, is self-reflexive and marked by either an outright rejection of transcendence or a general desacralization of everyday life. Yet, as Benavides writes, the self-questioning nature of modernity may also lead to a situation in which a re-enchantment of the world takes place ironically or aesthetically. So in your mind, hold on to this connection between irony and enchantment because it sets the stage for parody. So if irony mediates the desacralizing and resacralizing tendencies of the modern world, then the ironic re-enchantment of the world becomes even more salient in the mid-20th century when philosophers and theorists proclaim that the era of post-modernity is upon us. Post-modernity rejects the ordering mechanisms of modernity, like grand narratives, hierarchies, and rigid taxonomies. Instead, postmodernism is skeptical and self-referential. It deconstructs categories, unsettles truth, encourages relativism, and embraces irony. Here, parody circulates as a mode to negotiate conflicting attachments to religion. In a postmodern world, religion, for some, remains institutional, inherited, and based in tradition. But for many others, it is increasingly subjective, adopted ironically, played with, and innovated upon, because its seriousness and veracity are always up for debate and a loop of self-reflexive questioning. Now, 2 decades into the 21st century, social theorists and cultural commentators are beginning to suggest that we occupy a meta-modern moment. Scholars like Timotheus Vermeulen, Robert van den Akker, Luke Turner, and Joseph Storm suggest that meta-modernism is characterized by an oscillation between irony and sincerity, naivete, knowingness, relativism and truth, optimism and doubt. And in the meta-modern, parody remains as a tool for managing the ambiguity of life amidst the deconstructed categories and the aggressive relativism postmodernity has left in its wake. Religion in meta-modernism allows for simultaneity. In the meta-modern moment, it is possible to be neither nor and both and at the same time. People are spiritual but not religious, sincere but not committed, and seriously attached to their ironic religious attachments. As such, parody in a meta-modern moment reveals a kind of religiosity that is in on the joke. So all of this is getting a bit theoretical, so I'd like to bring it back down to earth and take a look at a few more clips that satirize SoulCycle to better understand how parody operates as a mode of meta-modern religiosity. So first, I'd like to watch a short clip from the trailer for the movie I Feel Pretty from comedian Amy Schumer.
Today you're gonna see what you've always wanted to be. Change your mind, change your life.
You hit your head pretty hard.
Wait, that's me?
Yes.
I'm beautiful! What's your number?
Very clever. All right, I'm gonna give you my number.
Are you talking to me?
Don't chicken out now, son. Yes, modeling is an option for me, but it's not who I am. Wow.
All right. Here we watch Schumer have a breakthrough moment of sorts while sustaining an injury at SoulCycle. Schumer pokes fun at herself while critiquing America's beauty standards, but she also mocks SoulCycle's spiritual and motivational messaging. In fact, much of the movie's humor rests on the incredulity that SoulCycle's spiritual aphorisms could actually have a profound, lasting impact and transformative effect. Let's take a look at another clip. This one is from Saturday Night Live. All right, in this clip, we watch Saturday Night Live make fun of the extensive SoulCycle instructor selection process as cast members give over-the-top performances as instructor wannabes. The clip goes on and on and on, so if you want to watch more of those instructor wannabes, you can find it on YouTube. But like Schumer, Saturday Night Live critiques SoulCycle's motivational messaging by having cast member Bowen Yang say what amounts to nonsense while delivering the proper inspirational cadence and hitting the right sermonic tones. And this is just one of many parodies of SoulCycle made by Saturday Night Live. But what I find most interesting about this clip is that it was clearly made with SoulCycle's cooperation. In the video, we see cast members appear in officially branded apparel. They are riding on SoulCycle's signature stationary bikes, and the set backdrop perfectly mirrors the walls of SoulCycle studios. The same can be said for Schumer's I Feel Pretty, which was filmed in a SoulCycle studio starring SoulCycle staff and SoulCycle instructors. So what are we to make of this evidence that SoulCycle is clearly in on the joke? First, we might think in terms of brand exposure. Quote, parodies help to elevate brand awareness and simply make us laugh, SoulCycle's Vice President of Public Relations and Brand Strategy shared in an interview. Parody, it seems, is good for the brand. If you take SoulCycle seriously, it profits. If you laugh at SoulCycle, it still profits. Second, we might think in terms of strategy. By being in on the joke, SoulCycle is getting out ahead of the joke. The discernible cues of corporate collaboration in the clips we viewed undermine the biting critique of their parody and protect SoulCycle from even more damning evaluations of their brand. By being in on the joke, SoulCycle is ultimately ensuring that even the most high-profile parodies remain on message and get reabsorbed into the brand. And finally, I think SoulCycle's embrace of parody conveys its own ambivalence towards the kind of religion it offers. Religion at SoulCycle is often playful, and for even the most earnest SoulCycle member, the religion of SoulCycle is still sometimes a joke. Take, for example, how instructors sometimes dress up as religious figures for fun, or how SoulCycle's logo purposely mimics a Buddhist Dharma wheel. The playfulness is apparent when we see that members refer to Dan's Saturday classes as spinagogue and Janet's Sunday morning classes as church. And when SoulCycle released a new booking application for its classes, members of its corporate office dressed up as a gospel choir to make a music video. They are evidently having a lot of fun with the religious gloss of their brand. And all of this points to how SoulCycle is not taking itself or the spiritual revelation it offers all too seriously. But conflicting information emerges when we look again. Signs posted around SoulCycle studios detailing the etiquette rules are quite clear that SoulCycle ought to be a truly spiritual place for those who want it. Rule number 2, for example, discourages chit-chat, noting that talking during class is a major distraction for the spiritual folks around you. Or take the example of SoulCycle's Securities and Exchange Commission filing for its initial public offering in 2015. Language in this IPO document reveals the degree to which the company takes the religious aspects of its brand seriously, describing itself as a, quote, meditative fitness experience designed to benefit mind, body, and soul while being spiritually uplifting. Furthermore, instructors I interviewed share how they planned the mini sermons they would deliver in class by investing in their own spiritual lives, from reading books by Deepak Chopra and studying astrology to visiting spiritual mediums. SoulCycle also doubles down on describing its studios as sanctuaries during Pride Month. In this example that we will soon see, from SoulCycle's 2019 Pride Month message, SoulCycle explains that when you're here, you are first and foremost a soul, a force of energy in a place that sees you. This has always been your space to escape, your space to celebrate. That's why we call it a sanctuary, and that's why all souls are welcome. So SoulCycle has leaned into this self-description after tragic events like the death of George Floyd. And in the summer of 2020, and before that, in 2019, SoulCycle had to ritually remake its sanctuaries when one of its shareholders hosted a campaign fundraiser for Donald Trump and the company faced a boycott. In a moment of corporate and communal crisis, SoulCycle sent each of its studios a smudge kit with spells, sage, crystals, and instructions for how to purify and reconsecrate the studio sanctuary space. So these are just a few of numerous examples that demonstrate SoulCycle's desire to have it both ways. At a moment that you make it serious, it becomes silly and lighthearted. When you concede its silliness, it envelops you in ceremony and solemnity. The religion of SoulCycle is slippery and ambivalent. It dwells in the marketplace and caters to the whims of its consumers. It defies easy categorization by offering you sincerity and frivolity at the same time. And this tacking back and forth between the absurd and the serious, this evasion of any sustained scrutiny, is made possible, I want to suggest, by parody as a mode of meta-modern religiosity. Parody exaggerates, pokes and prods. To be effective and funny, parody must master the form of its subject of critique, but in doing so, parody is also always dangerously close to becoming the thing that it scrutinizes, as we have seen in other examples from this lecture series, like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence and Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping Choir. In these examples, and in the example of SoulCycle, we see that the parody of religion so often becomes religion itself. And this form of religiosity, I wager, helps people navigate the modern and postmodern legacies in our meta-modern moment by being flexible, self-reflexive, and undecided about its own staying power. Parody is a mode of meta-modern religiosity that facilitates a closeness to religion while always leaving open the option of distance. What I hope to have shown today is that parody makes visible SoulCycle's tongue-in-cheek spiritual offerings as paradigmatic of religion in the meta-modern moment. Whether you laugh during the breakthrough moment or you cry, it doesn't really matter. SoulCycle knows that either way, you've experienced some kind of release. And either way, laugh or cry, they can cash in on that feeling. So, thank you.
So a fantastic set of talks, as expected. This is on. I don't have as good mic work as some of the comedians we just saw, so you'll have to bear with me. But in the moment that's often awkward as you're gathering your questions, I hoped I could ask the three of you about awkwardness in each of your talks to start bringing things together. One of the uses of comedy, as we all know, is comic relief. And often that comes from moments where we're not quite sure if we fit in or if we fit at all, or if there's some kind of tension that's new or unfamiliar to us. And I was wondering if each of you could talk about how the smoothing over that laughter, comedy, and humor can achieve is part of what you see in your research. And then we'll be taking questions from the audience from there.
The way I think about this, kind of in the context of the research that I'm doing, which is looking at the emergence of these really irreverent and iconoclastic forms of comedy, they're doing so explicitly against the dominant modes of kind of professional comedy in mid-20th century America, the kind of, to some extent Johnny Carson or Bob Hope, style of humor, as well as, forms of humor like rabbi, priest, minister type jokes, which are, at least in part, trying to smooth over religious difference, create a kind of sociable environment. So I think that that's definitely there, and I think that that's something to keep in mind, I guess, in the background, at least for me, of just like, what is it, the styles of humor, the functions that they're serving, why is it that you start to see more transgressive varieties of humor that are trying to actively kind of push back against those, those types of more amiable, relieving awkward social tensions and awkwardness. But that's how I think about it in my research.
Yeah, I'll add on to that, that the comedian's work is building tension and releasing tension, right? That's kind of fundamentally what goes into joke craft. And the Muslim comedian is particularly well suited to this because, one, his body's already communicating something awkward, right? Is racism or Islamophobia awkward? I guess. But because of that, I'm arguing that it's kind of smoothed over, to use your words, by really enveloping it within these kind of broader secular American tenets. So you can talk about racism and Islamophobia because of the First Amendment, right? You can talk about the FBI informant at your mosque and how it ultimately didn't work out for him. And he's foiled in the end, right? He realizes he's not Al-Qaeda, he's just an asshole. That's how he knew I was an American, right? And that's the big laugh line at the end. So yeah, I think the Muslim comedians are particularly suited to this work.
Yeah, I think SoulCycle is quite interested in parody for the exact effect of the smoothing over, lest you start to think too carefully about income inequality, about why some people can afford $37 per session cycling classes, why there's boutique fitness in the first place. And I think it also feeds in very nicely to the building up and to the release, since I think they are experts at crafting that experience. So yeah, I think the parody captures that, but it also helps SoulCycle accomplish its brand mission. And that's why I find it so interesting that they are, in on the joke.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Well, I'd like to start with gratitude to the panelists for just such fun and such informative presentations today. What fun. So many questions I could ask. I'll start with Dr. Wright's observation on what takes me to that shuttle of what is interdicted, what is a transgressive occasion, and what is permissible or a remissive occasion. I'm going back to my own undergraduate days on that model of what is remissive. And it takes me to the court jester 1,000 years ago, and that person could mock the king and get away with it. And again, to all of you, relieve that tension. So I'll throw that out as a first question of that shuttle of interdiction, transgression, remission. I'll direct a question directly to Dr. Choudhury, but you may all want to address this one too. Going back 2,000 years to a rabbi wandering around in Palestine back then, telling these wonderful parables that were recorded in the Gospels. And I don't know that those actually happened any more than Minja really did get his head slammed against the hood of a police car. But again, I'd love to see you expand on that if you know those parables and what that's like. And I'm going to stop there. That's some fun discussion right there. But I could ask 20 more, I'm sure. Thank you.
I guess I can say a bit about the category of the jester, because this is an interesting cultural moment in which, jesters and also clowns have a kind of avant-garde, kind of prestige about them. In the 1960s, you have figures like Harvey Cox. You have kind of art films arising that are using these types of symbols and figures, and I think they're doing it. I think one of the reasons why Cox himself presents Jesus as a harlequin, as a jester, is to play with these boundaries, and that has something to do with kind of waves of new ethical kind of thinking that Protestant theologians like Harvey Cox are experimenting with, where they're trying to push against kind of the conventional boundaries, not completely relieve them, but shift them in a way, and are using this kind of figure, this style of irony and humor in a way to do that. But again, there's a lot to be said about that. But
Yeah, I'll just add to this notion of the jester. I love. In fact, the clip that I showed you of Minhaj's special is titled "The King's Jester." And while I'm not familiar exactly with the parables that you're referring to, I think that's also precisely why Minhaj was caught so off guard by the reaction that most people ended up having, and that it led to him, not getting this really coveted gig that Jon Stewart has now returned to. Precisely because it's not about the mechanics of the story per se, it's about how the story makes you feel. And that's what he's trying to get at with this phrase that he uses, emotional truth, that now has become, the thing that everyone's using to lampoon him for. But I think there's something there. And if you go back and look at the ways that a lot of other comedians kind of came to his defense in those days after the article came out, they all kind of came to the same conclusion that, nobody goes to a comedy show thinking that all of these things actually happened, right? The point is for the punchline. So to go to your other, another point that you made actually about, the jester and the premise of that, I think that's exactly it, is this word I keep coming back to, is premise. That stand-up suddenly creates a new space, a new time, a new moment that everybody is in on, right? Everybody is occupying at the same time, but it means that things that normally wouldn't pass, right? The normative ways of the world, suddenly those rules don't apply. There's this great book actually about Filipino boxers in LA. I'm gonna get back to it. It's gonna relate back, I promise. But about these men who are otherwise in the real world, right, dealing with racism, notions of Asian effeminacy and how they're not masculine enough. But in the boxing ring, they can beat up white men, right? And that's okay because the sport is not real, right? Or it's not the real world, in the way that the comedy stage may be reflecting something about the real world, but it's not exactly that. And in fact, Minhaj's new special now that he's touring with, that hasn't stopped his business, by the way, is called Off With His Head. So staying with the the theme of the jester.
Samah, if I could interject, I'm so interested in this instance with Hasan Minhaj, and while it's not always useful to think through the categories of postmodern or meta-modern, I was struck by how he seems like the perfect meta-modern comic in a way. If you have truth unsettled and subjective, such that you don't really need it to tell a joke, or there is a truth located elsewhere, then I think moving through that as smoothly as he does and as confidently as he does is sort of an index to the meta-modern. Like, well, of course it wouldn't be truthful because there's a truth elsewhere. Like that sort of assumption that he has that makes him feel like very of the moment in a way.
Yeah, definitely. You actually gave me a vocabulary for this that I think I hadn't thought of before, so you can... Yeah, you betcha. I was taking notes as you were talking.
Another question.
Hello, my question is for Professor Musselman, and maybe this is a little inside baseball here, but I took her class on sports and religion, and so I was just thinking throughout your talk about irony as it relates to providentialism, because soft providentialism, I mean, you can probably explain these terms better than I can, so I'll just let you do it in your response, but it almost serves as a form of absolution within spirituality, and I think that the relationship of irony in that is really interesting. And also in hard providentialism, it would be in some cases retroactive application of spirituality to, again, confirm or absolve something. So I guess if you could speak to that.
Great, yeah. So for audience members who were not in our course this last fall.
You're lost.
And that's right. We were talking about soft providentialism. So providentialism just as the notion that God has ordained something to happen. And so soft providentialism is a way of describing language that acknowledges that in a way that is not very forceful. So for among athletes, for example, you might think of them saying as God gave me a healthy body. And so I will play my best because I have a healthy body. Whereas hard providentialism will be it's God's will that we win this game, and so I think to your point, Nicole, about like the retroactive ability to look at something and say, well, of course God ordained that because it happened, and I can fit that within the narrative I have in my head. And I think there is a lot of sort of soft providentialism happening within a SoulCycle studio for sure, where you're thinking about how you can map these aphorisms onto your own life. Phrases like, how you do anything is how you do everything. And you start thinking, okay, I guess it is. But it's also sort of putting sometimes the power elsewhere, the meaning, the intention, into sort of the figure of a God or of a universe that is helping you manifest something. And that manifestation is a form of sort of a soft providentialism. So I'm not sure if does that quite get at your question, Nicole? Okay. Great. Happy to riff. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Michael.
Hi. Thank you all for such a really fun discussion. I think fun has been the operative term. I want to introduce a different term that I think the Hassan Minhaj example sort of raised, which is, can you talk a little bit about the intersection between parody and sincerity? In a sense that, so in Minhaj's case, I think the betrayal there is a sense that people thought he was sincere. It didn't matter whether it was true or not, but the fact is the expose suggested the idea that he wasn't sincere in the moment when he was relaying that example. And in a way, I can imagine a similar sort of dynamic with, at least I'll say for myself, I was never a fan of George Carlin until he finally said, like, for me, this is why I'm a comedian. And it's when he reveals his sincerity that I'm like, oh, I get it. And that's when I can start to laugh at his jokes. And there's this kind of like requirement of performing sincerity that allows parody and comedy to land. And I'm wondering if that's something that you see in the examples that you've laid out. And of course, there's a lot of questions around like, well, what is the expectation for sincerity for racialized bodies, for example? Like, that's a different kind of performance there. But yeah, I was wondering if you can think along the lines of sincerity as a particular kind of, as another category that, and how it interfaces with parody as the category that you're all wrestling with as well. Thank you.
That's a great word, and I think it's really central to this discussion. And it is exactly what you said, right? It's that the mask felt lifted. The mask of sincerity that we all thought was there is revealed to have been a mask. And that's exactly why folks felt so betrayed. And for Minhaj, his entire brand of comedy relied on that, right? It was built on social commentary, yes, but sincere social commentary. And he very much presented himself as that off the comedy stage as well. If you go back and look at interviews, he talks about getting into this business of stand-up because he is interested in, what was the phrase he used that will definitely be in the book because I have the notes. But he refers to stand-up as a form of confession, right? As transformative confession, I think is actually what he says. And that he sees himself in line with other sincere comics, like you said, Carlin, Dick Gregory, Lenny Bruce, and perhaps most importantly, Richard Pryor. And I think all of that hinges on sincerity, and that's kind of also why he went up in flames, because suddenly, and you can see, I mean, there was a reason I played such a long clip, was because I wanted everyone to be able to see how he toggles between, right, the laugh lines, but then also the moment where he says, and then I saw my friends lined up, and then the walkie-talkies were going off, and I was going to be brought in. Those are incredibly sincere, unfunny moments that, yes, maybe the punchline relies on, but it's because the audience believes it, right? They believe it to be sincere.
I think Lenny Bruce is kind of an instructive case, though, of the dangers of too much sincerity. I mean, famously, towards the end of his life, Bruce dies at age, I think, 40 of an overdose. He's gotten to the point where many of his performances are just kind of extended riffs on his own legal problems, obscenity, kind of, First Amendment issues, and even many of his friends and sympathizers kind of see him as having a kind of break, where he's simply kind of talking about these issues in too sincere a way and has left comedy and humor behind. And so it's a tricky balance. That's always a kind of danger, I guess, in some ways, I think, and plays into this entire somewhat self-congratulatory mythology, right, of the truth-telling, especially male comedian. that's a thing to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sincerity is such an interesting word to think through, because in some ways, it is an index to some kind of truth. It's the thing that is relatable to other people. But also what happens if you feel some kind of ambivalence towards your own sincerity or your own sense of truth. Like, truth is not always stable. It's changing within people, perspectives at all times. And so I think I love the example of the SoulCycle parodies for exactly that point, which is that because I think SoulCycle embodies this ambivalence towards religion while also offering a sincere outlet for religion, it allows you to do both, and it allows you to think about your complicated feelings about having to be sincere, or what an sincere expression towards others and for others to observe is like.
Thank you. Well, before I invite you all to join me sincerely in thanking our panel, I want to announce the last evening in our series, which will be on April 16th at 5 p.m., I think in the same room. And we'll be hosting Anthony Petro, a professor at Boston University of Religion, to talk about his new project in a lecture called Playing the Sacred, the Camp Aesthetics of Feminist and Queer Art. And with that, I hope you'll continue the conversation outside these doors, and thank you so much to our panelists for a wonderful evening.